Like the fourth quarter of a basketball game, the shots the players make now begin to be of interest. The field of probable Republican candidates numbers 2, and I can't recall the name of one of those. And the field of Democratic candidates continues to grow, although the conventional wisdom says it's really only 2. The issues that will be debated, perhaps declaimed is a better word, are fairly clear. The economy, the treatment of so-called minority groups, including one that's a majority, the military, the bomb, foreign policy, and perhaps a few others. But I suspect that the turn of events that will decide the election lies ahead. Probably no one is better situated to speculate on these things than David Broder, national political correspondent of the Washington Post. Mr. Broder's observations of presidential politics and campaigns began officially in 1956, and he's not missed a beat since that time. His fellow Washington, D.C. correspondents have voted him the most respected political correspondent, and in 1973 he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for distinguished commentary. His column appears in several hundred American newspapers, including ours, most recently yesterday, concerning the possible political shockwaves of Grenada and Lebanon. Mr. Broder was born in 1929, began his newspaper career with the Bloomington Pantagraph, owned by Adlai Stevenson's family. I wonder how many of you know what a pantagraph is. I do. I have to wait. Between there and the Washington Post, he was a reporter for the Congressional Quarterly, the Washington Star, and the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. He's a contributor to magazines such as The Atlantic and Harper's, author of 3 books on matters political, participant in many radio and television political panels, and a frequent speaker on public platforms, including ours. He spoke to us in January 1975 on The Press and the President, and probably many of you were there. He is in the Pacific Northwest for a short time, particularly Seattle, to cover the Evans-Lowry race for the late Senator Jackson's seat. And Mr. Broder flew down, I think he arrived about 11:30 today for this speech, and he's hustling right back out to the airport and will be back up in Seattle by about 3 o'clock this afternoon. So we're delighted that he is able to be with us today to discuss the issues and the candidates in the presidential race. David Broder.
Thank you very much. I was honored to be invited back, and I'm delighted to be back even briefly in Portland. There are not a lot of laughs in the world situation these days or in the political arena, but those of us who cover politics are at least having a chance to make a short nostalgia trip. George McGovern is running for president again. Henry Kissinger is straightening out at least some of the world's problems again, and it's revived a story that was popular in Washington, I guess about 11 or 12 years ago when Kissinger was Secretary of State and McGovern was the presidential candidate for the first time, about a trip that supposedly was made on a special Air Force plane where the passengers were the President of the United States, Mr. Nixon, the Secretary of State, Dr. Kissinger, the Pope, and a hippie stowaway who got aboard somehow just before the plane took off from Andrews Air Force Base. And according to the story, about halfway over the Atlantic, the pilot got on the intercom and said, "Gentlemen, I've got very bad news for you. We have a serious mechanical problem. We are not going to be able to make it back to where we started or cross. You're going to have to put on parachutes and bail out, but we have radioed our positions and rescue planes are on the way. You'll be picked up very promptly, so if you would now please just put on the parachutes. Good luck." So Mr. Nixon was the first to his feet and said, "I'm the President of the United States. I'm the leader of the free world, Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces. My safety is of utmost importance to the world," and out the door he went. Kissinger was on his feet right behind him, and he said, "I am the smartest man in the world. I am the greatest diplomat since Metternich. I have solved more problems, and if there's going to be any chance for dealing with the remaining problems in the world, I've got to be saved." Grabs a parachute and goes right out the door. At this point, the Pope and the young hippie look at each other with great shock, because it's obvious to both of them that there's only one parachute left. And there is a long and awkward silence, which the Pope finally breaks by saying, "Young man, take the parachute. I am an old man. You are young. My life is completed. Your life is ahead of you. I have done what I was put on earth to do. I am at peace with the Lord. Take the parachute." And the hippie says, "Be cool, Padre. There's no problem." And the Pope says, "What do you mean?" He said, "There are two parachutes for both of us." The Pope says, "It's a miracle." And the hippie says, "No, it isn't. The smartest man in the world just went out the door with my knapsack on his back." Well, I am not the smartest man in the world. I'm not even the smartest on the Washington Post, because even at this late date, I still don't know who Deep Throat was. So there are no guarantees that go with any of this political analysis. I want you to know that. Let's start on the Republican side, because I think that's a simpler situation to describe. I think the assumption that everybody has now is that Ronald Reagan is a candidate for re-election. I have to confess to you, I've changed my mind about this subject in the last couple months. I think probably up till around the 4th of July, I really thought it was very likely that the president would, in George Aiken's words about Vietnam, declare victory and go home, say that he'd put in place policies that he'd promised the American people to start, that those policies were beginning to work, and now it was up to other people to carry on. But he's given some interviews, particularly one that he gave the Los Angeles Times around the 4th of July, that suggests that strongly that he has not looked forward to the joys of retirement, that he finds the job for the most part very satisfying and rewarding, not a burden. And my impression overall of Mr. Reagan is that he does not dissemble, that he does not play games, particularly with his own party, and particularly, I think, with his good friend, Paul Laxalt. I don't think he would put Laxalt out on that limb and then saw it off behind him. So while he has clearly left himself some wiggle room as to, if something should occur, to withdraw the candidacy, I think he understands that it would be a terribly disconcerting, debilitating event from the point of view of Republican prospects in 1984, and I fully expect to see him become the Republican candidate. He is in the fortunate position, which few recent presidents have done, of knowing that there is no significant opposition within his own party. That means that they can devote all of their plans, efforts, and money from now on until planning for that day in November of 1984. I think everything we've seen of Ronald Reagan from his first race as for governor of California indicates that he will be a competent, effective candidate once again. And having watched the wind-up of the British election campaign, in which Mrs. Thatcher and her conservative government were returned to power in a country whose economy was considerably worse shaped than ours is at this point, I think he has one powerful argument to make under almost any foreseeable circumstance, which is that if you understand that there is bound to be a certain amount of pain with any large and wrenching change into foreign or domestic policy, and if you understand that you have paid a price now for the effort that has been made by the administration, and this is an argument that Thatcher made, why not play the game out? Why not see how it's going to come out? Why not see if there's going to be some reward in the end for the pain that you suffered, rather than go back and start all over again with a different set of policies and a different set of leaders? Let me turn quickly to the Democratic side. We now have 8 candidates in the race, with Jesse Jackson's announcement yesterday. As you noted, most people think that it's really going to be either Mondale or Glenn, and I don't dissent from that judgment. Not because I think there's any great attachment at this point to either of those two gentlemen. There is not enormous amount of enthusiasm that's visible for either of them, even among the Democratic Party activists. And it is certainly worth pointing out in November of 1983 that about 20 million people will take part in the choice of the Democratic nominee as participants in primaries or the open caucuses. And I would suppose it's probably a safe assumption at this point that at least 95% of those people have not spent 5 minutes up to this point thinking about who they want to support for the Democratic presidential nomination. So anybody who says that it's locked up this way or that has to reckon with the fact that the people who have the key to that lock really have not thought about how they're going to turn it. But there is a fact that it enters into this calculation, and that is that the new Democratic Party nominating schedule, the front-end loading of that schedule, makes it much more difficult than it's been in the past for people like McGovern or Jimmy Carter to establish themselves suddenly by a plurality win in Iowa or New Hampshire, and then turn around, raise the money, move the organization into place in other states to capitalize on that first upset victory and upset and defeat the early front runner or front runners. Between March 13th of next year and April 10th, literally half the states in the country will choose delegates, including such huge states in terms of electoral politics as New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Michigan, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. All of those states pick delegates in the space of about 3.5 weeks. That's as close to a national presidential primary as we've ever had in this country, and it means, in the judgment of most of the Democratic professionals, that unless you've got your money and organization pretty well in hand by the first of the year in 1984, even if you should win some kind of an upset victory, it's going to be very hard to capitalize on it. So let's, for the purposes of this discussion, focus on the strengths and weaknesses of those two front runners, Mr. Mondale and Senator Glenn. In the case of former Vice President, I think his assets are very familiar to most of the people in this room. He certainly starts out as the best known, most closely connected of any of the Democrats with the active leadership of the Democratic Party and its allied interest groups around this country. Nobody has spoken more often in more Democratic rallies. Nobody has been in more union halls or teacher assemblies and conventions than Walter Mondale in the last 10 years. And he knows those leaders of those organizations. They know him. Most of them feel very comfortable with him, and he certainly feels very comfortable with them. He has put together what is by far the best of the organizations in the Democratic field at this point, and he now has the teachers and the trade unions working with his organization as well. He's raised more money than anybody else in the race, and for the reasons of the schedule that I mentioned just a moment ago, having the money available early is going to be very important this time. Finally, he is a tested candidate who has been over the ground of presidential politics and campaigns before. He is relatively unlikely to make the sort of fatal misstatement or misjudgment that throws a campaign completely off track, and so far really has managed to avoid that kind of error entirely. He has two liabilities, I think, at this stage of the game. First is a tactical problem, but it may be of some significance. The vote on the left of the Democratic Party, particularly in the early caucuses and primary states, is going to be very much splintered up. You've got Jackson, McGovern, Alan Cranston, Gary Hart, all of whom are going to take out their chunks of vote in states like Iowa, New Hampshire, and the other early states on the calendar. While Senator Glenn has only Ruben Askew and Fritz Hollings to his right, and neither of them has showed up to this point much capacity for drawing large support. That means that the scenario is there that may yielded the Carter nomination in 1976, namely multiplicity of liberal left candidates and one candidate on the conservative side who moves ahead on the basis of plurality voting. I think the chances are that this is not going to be a serious problem for Mondale in Iowa, the caucuses, where his share of the vote in that caucus situation probably may approach the 50% level. It could be a more serious problem in New Hampshire, the first primary, because there both Hart and Cranston have significant campaigns underway. And now with Jesse Jackson in the field, it could be a very significant problem for Mondale in terms of the black vote in the southern phase of Super Tuesday on March 13th, when 5 or 6 southern states in the space of 3 days will have primaries or caucuses. The second and probably larger problem for Mondale is that he does not come to this race brand new and virginal. He has a political history of a very clear sort that he brings with him. He is Hubert Humphrey's protege, and that stamps him indelibly as an advocate of the kind of liberal programs of the 60s and 70s that I think even many of the activists and leaders in the Democratic Party have come to believe have lost some of their appeal in the 1980s. Secondly, he was Jimmy Carter's vice president, and the Carter administration is spoken of rarely, I think, in Democratic rallies these days, because most Democrats understand that it was not a highly successful administration in political terms or in the present judgment of most of the voters of the country. Senator Glenn's list of weaknesses and strengths is almost exactly a mirror image of Mondale's. He is relatively unfamiliar to many of the Democratic Party leaders and activists. He has relatively weak ties and alliances with them. His organization at this point is very much weaker than the Mondale organization. As you all know, his director of field operations, the person who was supposed to be putting that organization together, Joe Gramazon, quit just 2 weeks ago and has now been replaced by a kind of triumvirate. And it's uncertain, I think, in the minds of many people who've dealt with that organization whether they have yet solved the fundamental problems within it. He's raised somewhat less money than Mondale has, although he's much more competitive in the financial area than he is in the organizational area. And finally, Senator Glenn is a first-time national candidate who is liable to, and in some respects already has demonstrated, certain awkwardness about stating his positions and views of a kind of awkwardness which we haven't seen, at least so far, from Mr. Mondale. His assets are very clear also. He is a new face. He does not come with any scars from past battles to this race. He has been an enormously effective candidate for the Democratic Party in the state of Ohio, a vital political battleground itself, and one that tests a candidate pretty thoroughly. He won, I believe, all but one county in the state of Ohio in 1980, while Mr. Reagan was carrying the state at the top of the ticket for the Republican side. As a result of this record and his obvious sort of personal appeal, the aura that is there as a result of his pre-political experiences, he is seen, I think, by many of the people in the Democratic Party leadership as somebody who might be a stronger candidate and perhaps even a winner against Mr. Reagan. As of now, between these two men, Mondale clearly would have the edge. Senator Glenn has not used 1983 to maximum advantage, particularly in the organizational area. He now has roughly 4 months left before the voting begins to try to make up for that time and that lost advantage, and he will be under considerable pressure to show that he's overcome that liability. Let me conclude with just a few preliminary observations on the general election. I don't know what the latest public opinion polls say, but my gut feeling is that if the election were literally being held today, Ronald Reagan would probably win the election against either Mr. Mondale or Senator Glenn. The economy on the national level, at least, is improving. The 8.8% unemployment rate announced today is lower, I think, than most people expected to see at this point. Real income is up. And again, if I can refer to that British experience for just a moment, I was struck there by the fact that even though unemployment was consistently listed as the most serious problem facing the country, when it came to being a voting issue, it was not really that important a voting issue, because the largest overwhelming number of people in the electorate were people who were either at work with jobs or people who were retired. And for those people, while they may have sympathized with those who were out of work, the fact that inflation was down and real incomes were up in Britain meant much more politically than the risk and the loss that other people had suffered on the unemployment side of that economic equation. The approval at this point of President Reagan's foreign policy and handling of foreign policy is up. at least in the short term, the public approval of Grenada and the action there has overcome the deep-seated, and I think probably certainly persistent, concern and worry about the exposure of the Marines and of American interests generally in Lebanon, the Middle East, and Central America. Events will change, we all know that, and so the fortunes of these candidates and rivals will change, and therefore so will the attitudes of the American people. So I want to conclude just simply by talking about what I think may be a more persistent and underlying factor in this 1984 election, and the factor that makes it, I think, an unusually and uncommonly interesting election. The 1980 election was different from most that we have had. Mr. Reagan, in my judgment, went to the American people with a fairly clear diagnosis of what had gone wrong in this country, both in its foreign policy and in its domestic policy. He said that he would attack the foreign problem, the loss of American influence and prestige, by speaking more clearly and by backing up his words with a very greatly expanded defense establishment. He said he would attack what was then the overriding problem of inflation and its depredations of family budgets by going to what he said was the heart of that problem, namely big government, high spending programs, and the taxes to support those programs, and the whole regulatory structure that he said was impeding the performance of the American economy. I think the American people heard that diagnosis. I think they understood what he intended to do. They voted for him, and they did more than that. They gave him control of the policy mechanism by electing Republicans to a majority in the Senate and giving the Republicans for 2 years working control with the conservative Democrats of the House of Representatives as well. As a result of that election, policies changed, and changed fundamentally in almost every area of policy of national policy. Whether your interest is foreign policy, military policy, domestic policy, welfare policy, economic policy, environmental policy, there are very few Americans today who are not aware of the fact that the policies being pursued by the federal government are significantly different from what they were before the day that Ronald Reagan was elected, and they understand that those policies have changed because he was elected. That suggests to me that we are going to have a very issue-oriented election in 1984, in which the Democratic Party essentially will make the case against those policies, and Mr. Reagan will be making the case for those policies. If you look at the polling data today, and if you're out doing the kind of grassroots reporting, which we've begun to do in some of the early contest states like Iowa and New Hampshire, what becomes clear to you is that there is not one American electorate, there are two American electorates sitting in judgment on those Reagan policies. Putting aside for a moment the gender gap, and I want to come back to that in just a second, take a very old-fashioned way of looking at the American electorate in terms of economic and class status. If you're talking to somebody who's from a family where the family income is below $20,000 a year, or certainly below $15,000 a year, chances are that you will hear that person say that they think that Reaganomics has been bad for them personally, that it has hurt the country, that they will say that they disapprove of Mr. Reagan's policies, and they will tell you that they are pessimistic about the future, where the country is headed. If you're talking to somebody in a family where the family income is over $30,000 or certainly $35,000 a year, the chances are you will hear exactly the opposite answers. They will feel that the Reaganomics has worked well for them personally and for the country. They will approve of his conduct of the presidency, and they will be optimistic about the direction that the country is heading. You have a very significant middle income group there, large, who will probably make their decision in terms of the pocketbook issues on the basis of what happens to the economy over the next 12 months. But on basis of today's performance, as I said, I think Mr. Reagan would win that election with a big asterisk and a big if behind that statement. And the asterisk and the if is simply this. That assumes that the electorate that we'll see in 1984 is roughly the same size and shape as those who voted in 1980. Now, this is where there's a great difference between the United States and Great Britain, because they have fairly constant and fairly high levels of turnout. That has not been the case in this country. As you know, turnout as a percentage of those eligible to vote has declined in this country in every election from 1960 through 1980, reaching its low point in historic terms in 1980. There is some reason, I think even a likelihood, that the turnout will expand significantly in 1984. Because in elections that have been conducted since Mr. Reagan became president, and since he gave this object lesson to the country and all of our citizens, that elections do count, that they do make a difference, we have seen a beginning of a pattern of increased participation in the electoral process. And what we're talking about specifically is this. There is a pattern of expansion which seems possible and perhaps even likely that could very much shift the odds of this election in the favor of the Democrats. If blacks in this country vote in anything like the numbers that they did in the Chicago mayoral election last winter, in the Philadelphia mayoral primary last spring, in the Boston mayoral primary just a few weeks ago, if Hispanics and particularly Mexican Americans vote in this country in anything like the numbers that they did in Texas in 1982 or in the Denver mayoral election earlier this year, if women in this country continue to increase their participation rates in the electorate, and if their attitude toward the Reagan policies, both domestic and foreign, remain as skeptical, I'm speaking now in statistical terms, as they have been consistently for the first 33, 34 months of his presidency, then the numbers shift in a way which make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the Republicans to assemble an electoral college majority. All of this we'll see as to whether that kind of mobilization takes place and to the extent to which it takes place. But it is probably more than any other factor, at least that I'm aware of, the new possibility in 1984 that should make the trip to next November 6th a very interesting one for all of us who are involved in covering it and participating in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've left a fertile field for questions and a good amount of time for them. Our first question, I believe, from Harry Demarest, our board host.
Dave, your opening story reminded me that I just recently heard Hugh Sidey comment that Richard Nixon still thinks he's president of the United States. And my question is, does Richard Nixon play a role in our foreign policy, and if so, what?
I can't answer that question in any detail, except that I do know that he has met with some regularity with both Bud McFarlane, who is now the National Security Advisor, and with his predecessor in that job, Judge Clark. I'm not aware of any personal contacts of any extensive nature between former President Nixon and Secretary Shultz, but there may be some. But I think in a private role, he continues to send messages and meet with some of those who are involved in shaping foreign policy.
We have a microphone in the middle of the room. City Club members are invited to ask questions.
Yes, Arnold Kogan, member of the City Club. Mr. Broder, if the Democratic Convention becomes deadlocked between Mondale and Glenn, who do you think the party will turn to at that convention for a nomination?
What an intriguing question. I would love to live long enough to cover one political convention that went beyond one ballot. And there is a change in the Democratic rules this time that makes it, at least theoretically, more possible. They've set aside 1 out of every 7 seats in Convention Hall for people who will be there because of the titles in front of their names, either elected officials or party officials. And those folks are allowed to go uncommitted if they choose to do so. So we've got a potential bargaining block. My hunch is that once again the primaries will determine the name of the Democratic nominee. But in the circumstance that you're talking about, there really has not been much speculation about this. My guess is that they might turn to a more, senior figure, somebody who's been through the battles before. This is really very theoretical. Maybe an Ed Muskie. Who else? I need suggestions because I'm. Pardon? Ted Kennedy. Kennedy is not a. Kennedy is not a consensus figure in the Democratic Party. I mean, if we learned anything at all out of the course of the primaries in 1980, it is that he does have a rather polarizing effect on Democratic Party constituencies. If that sort of unimagined and literally for a generation unseen situation would develop, I suppose all kinds of possibilities would come there. But it doesn't strike me that Kennedy is a strong bet to be a consensus figure at a Democratic convention in the foreseeable future. Frank Church, there's another. Okay, I mean we could probably go through the names of those who've run in '76 and '72 and didn't make it. But really, it's kind of an intriguing speculation that you raised, but it's not one that as you gather, my stumbling response that I've thought about for 5 seconds.
Dan Goldie.
Dave, you mentioned blacks, Hispanics, women. You didn't say anything about organized labor. And clearly, Ronald Reagan won by obtaining in the key industrial states a much higher percentage of blue-collar labor support than a Republican had been used to in the past. The AFL-CIO having endorsed Mondale early on, what is your judgment about the prospects for laborers going all out and taking the rank and file with them and changing those percentages from 1980 and affecting the outcome?
It's a hard question. I think there's no doubt that at the leadership level, labor has really got its back into this campaign. What Lane Kirkland understood a lot earlier than most of us reporters did was that because they have taken such a pasting on the economic front in the last 2 or 3 years and continue to take them, that there really is a kind of almost desperation on the part of labor leaders to change whatever the political equation in whatever way they can that would give them a little more leverage in what many of them really do see now as a kind of struggle for economic survival for the trade unions, and some of them would say for the members of those unions. Their back is into it. They are better organized in terms of lists and computerized capacity to reach their own members and to communicate with them than they have been for a very long time. Their credibility is higher than it's been in a long time in terms of the way in which labor actually operated in state campaigns in many major states in 1982. On the other hand, it's very clear that they do not have anything at this point that resembles a consensus in the rank and file on which Democrat to support. In Waterloo, Iowa, where I spent 6 days reporting, strong labor town, UAW and United Food and Commercial Workers. There is no rank and file agreement at all on support of Mondale, the endorsed candidate, and there's a good deal of skepticism even among the local leaders how many of them they'll actually be able to turn out for the Iowa caucuses. So when you talk about rank and file, I think they're a long way from being able to deliver anything like a block vote. On the other hand, it is certainly clear on the other side that the folks running the Reagan campaign understand that they have let that opportunity, that beachhead that they established in 1980, kind of wither away, in part through their policies and in part through simple political neglect. They have got Ronald Reagan, until these foreign crises came up, running around from constituency to constituency trying to reestablish some of those ties. But if you look at the people in the cabinet who have in the past occupied constituency posts, what you see in place after place, including the Labor Department, is that there is no contact between the place in the government where you would expect to see some political awareness of the needs and interests of that constituency and the policies that are being pursued on a day-by-day basis. So they've got a long way to go in their own judgment in terms of getting Mr. Reagan back up to the share of the vote that he had with blue-collar people and organized labor specifically in 1980.
Robert Winkle.
Mr. Broder, during the 1980 presidential campaign, we heard a lot of talk about a possible October surprise, especially in view of the proximity of the Falklands War to Mrs. Thatcher's re-election. Would you speculate on the possibility of having an October surprise in 1984?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher, to the best of my knowledge, did not privately or in any other way encourage the Argentines to send their troops ashore there, so I don't know that we can justly impute to her a political motive, though she certainly profited from it politically. I will now betray my total naivete. I never really believed the notion that the Carter administration would or could or even contemplated manipulating the hostage crisis for political timing. And I'd have to say that I'm very skeptical of the notion that Mr. Reagan would time some kind of a foreign policy move for that kind of domestic political effect. I'm probably totally naive about that, but I just my belief is that there are some issues and problems that tend to get dealt with on their own merits and on their own dynamic and timetable rather than because of their effect on the election.
Gene Higginbottom.
As you are probably aware, many social service agencies nationally are working very hard to get the unemployed, the very low-income people registered to vote. This nationally would include a lot of the single-head of households, etc. How successful do we have to become in order to make a significant difference at the polls? You alluded to that category somewhat, but can you give me any kind of ballpark figure of how successful we have to be?
Well, we know that last time barely over 50% of those who were eligible to vote in terms of their age and not having any felony convictions on their record, barely 50% of those people actually went to the polls. So you're talking about a marketplace in which any any person that you add is really sort of measured against 50% of that eligible population, not against the total population. I think it's clear in terms of some of these municipal elections and in some state elections last November, particularly Texas comes to mind, that the outcome was probably determined by the success of the registration and get out the vote campaign. And it is clear that that's going to be a strategy that is pursued importantly by both sides. The Republicans, among other things that they will do with this luxury of having a year to get ready for it, are probably going to put their most extensive effort into voter identification and voter registration that they have made in a very long time. So it'll be a competitive effort, but my own feeling is that the 1984 election will be at least as much a campaign of mobilization as it is one of persuasion. I think that public opinion in many respects is so polarized at this point by people's 3 years of judgments on the impact of the Reagan policies in areas of concern to them, that it's not likely that Mr. Reagan or his Democratic opponent will persuade a lot of people who think that they're the greatest thing since sliced bread or the worst thing since sliced bread to change their minds about those policies. And it's really going to be largely a question of who turns out the most folks.
Next question.
Hey, Jansen, member of the club. If Mr. Mondale wins the Democratic nomination as expected, whom do you anticipate he'll turn to for a running mate? Whom do you think would be his strongest running mate? Would Glenn, for example, be willing to take the second spot? And how important is the selection of the vice presidential nominee going to be for Democratic chances in 1984?
I think I could only attempt to answer the last question. My assumption is that it'll be very important because I think that we are looking at a very closely contested election. Even if Mr. Reagan goes into it with the kind of favorable economic prospects and the level of approval of foreign policy actions that he enjoys today, it's very difficult to see him winning anything quite as broadly as the electoral electoral college margin that he had over Mr. Carter in 1980. So I think it's going to come down very much to a calculation of what specific groups, constituencies, or states can you add to your electoral coalition by picking this person or that person for vice president. In those circumstances, for example, on your assumption that Mondale is going to be number one on the ticket, I would certainly think that they would want to have the option of offering that nomination to John Glenn, for the simple reason that no Republican president in modern times has been elected without carrying the state of Ohio. And if John Glenn, on the basis of your polling, would suggest that he brings Ohio into the Democratic column, that in itself becomes a very powerful argument. Similarly, somebody who could bring in one or more of the southern states would be very important for a Mondale ticket. Similarly, somebody who might bring in, say, some of that blue-collar ethnic Italian vote that might otherwise not be a natural constituency for Mondale. I would guess that the process is going to be one that is heavily affected by the polling, and in terms of the kind of calculus of very specific electoral vote coalitions as to which way you think you're going to try to get to 270 in this kind of an election year.
Yes, over here.
Mr. Broder, do you see any pluses for the Democratic Party in the now announced candidacy of Jesse Jackson?
The question is whether there are any pluses for the Democratic Party in the now announced candidacy of Jesse Jackson.
Most obvious advantage would be if Mr. Jackson uses his candidacy, at least in part, to stir the interest and push the registration of black voters. That would almost certainly be a direct one-to-one advantage for the Democrats going into the general election. Beyond that, it becomes very, much a question as to how Jackson is going to campaign, how long he's going to campaign, and how he affects the dynamics of the race. I think he is realistic enough to understand that he is unlikely to be the Democratic nominee, but he certainly brings a different mix of views, policies, and style to that platform than any of the others who are up there now. I think he's going to make it, for example, the early Democratic candidate forums that'll be on national television, the League of Women Voters sponsored events. I think they'll probably have a larger audience because in part people are going to be curious to see how Jackson plays it and how the others deal with the kind of questions, rhetoric, and issues that Jackson raises. All of this now really changes on the dynamic of the race, and I don't think you can tell at this point, because we haven't seen him in this role at all yet, whether he's going to be, plus or minus to the Democrats in the way in which he impacts on that race. But in terms of registration, I think that is clearly going to be a potential significant benefit to the Democrats.
Jane Bloom at the mic.
Mr. Broder, I'd like to follow up on the possible minority participation in the general election, if I may. You said that you felt one way that the political stakes could be tipped towards the Democrats would be if people in minority groups would register and vote, and that would tip the scales towards the Democrats. Now, I assume that Jesse Jackson's participation in the primaries anyway is very valuable in terms of registration. But if minority groups who are registered don't see any potential in the candidates who are running, what would persuade them to vote Democrat? In other words, would you need a Jesse Jackson to go out campaigning actively for the Democratic nominee, or would you need a minority person in the vice presidential spot? And do you think that any potential nominee for president on the Democratic side would have that kind of political courage to nominate a minority for vice president?
My impression is that a substantial part of the case that any Democratic nominee needs to make to activate the black community and to get virtually unanimous political support in the black community has been made for him by Ronald Reagan. I mean, I think Reagan has activated the black community, and in very real. Since I am not a Democrat and have no part in their strategizing, I don't feel inhibited about saying I think their political calculus would be that they do not need a black on the ticket in order to secure that kind of support and level of effort in the black community, and I'd be very surprised if there was a black on the ticket. They would obviously like to have Jackson campaigning in the black community in the general election, and I think they believe at this point that they've got at least a verbal commitment from him that he will be around when the general election campaign begins.
Question down front.
Maurice Jacobi, a member. Mr. Broder, I would like to turn for a minute to the Lebanese situation. Gemayel is coming to Washington, D.C., I understand, trying to get Reagan to have the Israelis pull out from Lebanon. What do you think of that whole situation there? What will happen?
The question asked for comments regarding the Lebanese situation, and particularly the President Gemayel's pending visit to Washington to persuade Reagan to help the Israelis pull out.
The topic is far more important than anything we have discussed so far, but unfortunately I am not the competent person to answer that question. I've never been in that part of the world, and all of my information of it is the same as yours, which is derived from other reporters and so on. I don't feel that I have any clear grasp as to how we deal with that Lebanese situation as it exists today, and I think the prospects in the immediate future do not seem to me to be very bright. But I would be a fraud if I attempted to pass myself off as an expert on the Lebanese situation of the Middle East, because I'm just not.
Back to the mic.
Janet Smith of the City Club. Recent polls seem to suggest that a woman vice presidential candidate might be very acceptable to the voting public. What do you see as the likelihood a woman candidate would emerge, and what the effect would be on the election?
I think a woman vice presidential candidate is not only acceptable but probably very attractive to the electorate, and I think that we are probably within one election of having a woman on the ticket in either first or second place. I think very likely there will be a woman vice presidential candidate, and she will be on the ticket with John Anderson. I don't think it's likely that there will be one on the Republican ticket, because Mr. Bush has been promised that job by Mr. Reagan, and Mr. Reagan is not likely to change that promise, despite the fact that there would be some obvious political attraction for the Republicans in putting a woman on their ticket. The Democrats have a difficult problem, just a practical problem, because at this point there is not a woman United States Senator, there is not a woman governor on the Democratic side. And now that's about to change, I think, in Kentucky, but it's unlikely, I think, that somebody who has been governor of Kentucky for 7 months would be the nominee of the Democratic Party for vice president next summer in San Francisco. I've written, and I really believe this to be true, that had Ella Grasso not died of cancer a little less than 2 years ago, if she were still governor of Connecticut, she would be on and probably at the top of anybody's short list of Democratic vice presidential candidates, because she fits exactly what they would want. She is a lifelong professional politician who understands the way in which politics operates and is highly respected by other politicians. She is a proven, or was a proven, executive in her own right, and a very effective legislator before that. She was a role model for both people who would look for traditional-minded women and for feminists. And she was, in addition, happily for the Democrats, a Roman Catholic and an Italian. And that was I think the odds, it would have been at least a 50% shot that Ella Grasso would have been the Democratic vice presidential candidate had she lived.
At the mic.
Larry Brown, member of the club. After months of being told that there was no serious prospect of action on the deficit until 1985, at which time everyone agrees it was going to be almost too late to solve the problem, we now find a certain amount of scurrying around on both cutting spending and tax issues. Is there any chance of any of this happening before it's too late in the political season? And secondly, while I'm here, if no one else asks, could you comment on the control of the Congress as being influenced by the presidential race?
On the first question on the Senate, the scurrying around is basically Bob Dole and a couple of other Republicans on the on the Senate Finance Committee, encouraged by some of the folks on the Senate Budget Committee who see this problem in the very large dimensions, which I think in fact it has. Very little chance of anything being put together, I think, before Congress quits this year. Depends on what happens to interest rates in the next 2 or 3 months. If people decide that see the interest rates are going up and see that that might choke off the recovery, I think Congress might, almost against its own will, be forced to do something about those deficits before the 1984 election. But there's not a lot of courage, and particularly when the President of the United States and his Secretary of Treasury are pretending there isn't really a serious problem to be solved. As far as control of the Congress is concerned, we'll have a better read after this election Tuesday in the state of Washington. If Mike Lowry should knock off Dan Evans, I think both in practical and symbolic terms that would encourage enormously the Democratic hopes for getting majority of the Senate back. The chances are that they will then pick up some strength in the Senate if the election were being held today. Chances are that they wouldn't pick up the 5 or 6 seats that they would need for control as of now. But most of those races really are not very well defined or really launched at this point. It's possible, but not likely, I guess, is the right sort of shorthand of it.
Time for one final question from Debbie Davidson.
Back to Jesse Jackson. He's such an egotist. Do you feel, or have any guess, of after the Democratic Convention, whether he'll leave his constituency in the Democratic Party or try to do something else with
I would not try to psychoanalyze or outguess Jesse Jackson or any others of those running in terms of. I think there are probably at least 8 healthy egos now in the Democratic race. He will be under enormous pressure to support the Democratic nominee for the reasons that we've talked about already. I think the black community, probably more than any other community in this country, feels that they went from being in a position of influence and power, which they had during the Carter administration, to being as far out of power and, as they see themselves, as much victimized by the policy changes of 1980 as any constituency in this country. And I don't think there would be broad support either at the leadership level or in the community level for a black leader who pretended that there were not real choices to be made between Ronald Reagan and the Democratic nominee. So I think that Jackson will be under enormous pressure to support that Democratic nominee, whoever it is. And my guess is that he is realistic enough, whatever the level of his own ego, to understand that that would be the politic thing for him to do.
Mr. Broder, thank you very, very much.